Hi, everyone. My name is Will Smith. I'm the editor of Art in America magazine, and I'm talking with Brandon Ndife today about his work. So, Brandon, I just wanted to start um, by talking about your recent show at Bureau,
Yeah.
which was installed. Did it open briefly? Was there an opening?
So technically, no, there wasn't an opening. The exhibition was actually slated to open, I think, actually 3 days or so after Cuomo initiated the stay-at-home orders for New York. So March 20th was a Friday, and so I was installing that whole week. And the gallery director, Gabrielle Giotano, uh, and the others who work at Bureau we were thinking of doing a small thing that led to a smaller thing that led to eventually just a virtual exhibition based on the crisis, actually.
But fortunately, we do have some beautiful install shots. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can talk about them. I'd love to hear you describe some of your process and methods in creating a work like the one that we're seeing on the screen.
Mm-hmm. I mean, so a lot of the process that I used has to do with combining natural forms and more everyday forms that we live with inside of our homes, inside of others' homes, inside of our places of work. So I initially start a lot of my sculptures with casting. And for me, casting uh, is a way for me to kind of keep an index of the natural world that I find interesting in my studio. And then I'm able to kind of create any kind of combination of a multitude or a lack of certain forms. So say, for instance, the sculpture that we're looking at here, a lot of what comprises it is of these certain tubers and vegetables. So a lot of what goes into it has been these gourds and has been these other underground tubers that kind of manifest in these furnitures. So a lot of times I'll start with a rubber cast, manipulate a lot of its physical properties via the substrate that I use to cast, like foam or aqua resin, to kind of get a more natural feel. Almost, I can get a lot of textures and a lot of that materiality of stretching, literally stretching the substrate to its limit. And then what goes into the next stage of that is the assemblage, the color, a lot of added materials to kind of bring about physical properties in nature artificially. And that is juxtaposed a lot of times with these very ready-made forms that I either find or I reproduce by hand with out of wood or MDF, these very common household materials, to present a very fictional kind of array of these kind of unsuspecting but very strange and off-putting combinations. So that's where I draw a lot of the inspiration from. The outside maybe kind of blossoming or bursting into these very ready-made materials or objects.
Now, do you see the work that you were presenting at Bureau as a new development in your practice? Is this a new direction for you, or is it a continuation of themes that you've been exploring for some time?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think a lot of this work is a very long, convoluted trajectory from my studies, actually from undergrad. During my undergrad years, specifically my senior year, I was in school during Hurricane Sandy, 2012, I believe, that fall. And I was immediately kind of compelled by this natural disaster that kind of unilaterally shut down New York for a little bit. So much so that like now I didn't have school, I didn't have classes for about a month. And during that period, it was sort of like a New York that I didn't really know, a New York that I hadn't really seen before. So, trains were shut down, of course, and businesses and, buildings didn't have power. So I was going around New York taking photographs of the kind of aftermath of the storm. And for me, I was finding a lot of compelling sculptural aspects and a lot of sculptural inspirations from detritus that was kind of blown to bits around New York. And that kind of started my interest in using found objects and more natural forms to kind of talk about it, maybe a condition that we always have to reckon with, that is always kind of behind us, always kind of looming, where, one natural thing or one kind of intervention from nature can kind of shut down our highly complex and high functioning system of living. And, what I really became interested is in literature, and as far as sort of theory, was how a lot of those systems breaking down reinforce these kind of latent structural discrepancies between citizens in America, particularly Black and Brown communities. I saw that firsthand with the neighborhood I was living in New York, but it started to really light a fire as far as what I was reading at the time and what I was really just seeing firsthand in my existence as a young person then. So this show has really been a material accumulation as far as a thought process that has really blossomed into now from then. So it's been a long time coming.
I think the notion of social systems breaking down when confronted with natural forces is a really compelling idea that comes through in your work. You mentioned using a number of ready-made forms and found objects. A lot of these are cabinets, domestic furniture. I'm curious about the place of domesticity in your practice.
Sure.
Why did you decide to sort of confront this idea of social systems breaking down while also evoking the inside of the home?
Right. I think for me, the domestic is really, I think it's also, as I mentioned before about systems breaking down, I think it's maybe the final stop of a system breaking down in the chain of commands in this country. I think for me, the home and the domestic is the most personal place you can get, is even considering living in a big city like New York. And it's also the place where policy and, identity formation, as far as where we stand as citizens, as a class, where we stand as far as racial lines, and how the government really recognizes us and take care of us, is inside of our home. As we fill out the census, being counted be one of the biggest civic duties one can do, in voting also being another one. Home becomes really a place where you come home from a long day of maybe code switching yourself, integrating into a more ubiquitous and separate identity. Home is, again, where you can kind of collect yourself and come back to a true sense of self. So I think for me, and, a lot of the work has, enlightened how I grew up and how I saw myself inside of my parents' house, and how having my own house and my own family now, how important it is to, you know, really relish and really identify with where home is. So for me, the domestic and these domestic forms are almost, you know, uh, maybe a characterization of, you know, a personhood. And, you know, these kind of juxtapositions between like these domestic furnitures and these more organic, unidentifiable forms that are kind of breaching into each other. I think for me, it's a meditation on, you know, identity. It's a meditation on, you know, class. It's a meditation on, you know, I think the precarity of all of our situations right now. I mean, we're having to reckon with where we stay so much more in this period that, you know, I think coming out of this, we will identify with where we are and where we come from so much stronger when we aren't interacting with each other outside of our homes.
I'm interested in the idea that there are these two natural disasters that have bracketed your practice. You know, Sandy, when you were a student, and now the COVID pandemic. And maybe there's something about the idea of a natural disaster that we can break down a little bit, because certainly it is a disaster from the social perspectives that you're talking about. But natural disasters are also always man-made, as the cliche goes. And maybe from nature's perspective, it's not really a disaster at all, but something different. And when I look at your sculptures, I see this idea of breakdown, but also images of organic growth, these tubers and vegetables coming in. And there's a kind of richness there, especially related to the organic effects that you're creating. So I'm wondering, are these always images of disaster, or is there something else underlying the work?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think that that actually took, you know, this long from me starting in my undergrad years to now to kind of be okay with maybe a cyclical kind of return to, from rather destruction to maybe being a place of regrowth and rebirth. You know, I think with anything human made and anything that happens as far as like in a timeline of, you know, just our time on Earth, there's always an after. And so for me to kind of claim a non-position or a middle between decay and regrowth is a really fruitful place. I mean, pun intended. I think I think for me, it's important for my work to kind of be a place for a meditation on what would come after that. Because I'm definitely always thinking of what will come after a certain problem, especially when it's brought to surface and especially when it's addressed. I think it's all of our kind of awareness that is involved in making sure progress happens. So in my work, there's a lot of tough reads, and there's still a lot of tough reads for myself as the maker to kind of deal with what's going on in them. But for everyone who has seen the work, I mean, including as we talk now, for there to be a potential for seeing a richness and actually growing, I think it's important, and I think it's something that I do leave in the middle, because I think for me, to kind of metaphorically think about my work as maybe addressing an issue in real life or a policy issue that doesn't really have a lot of aesthetic tangibility or kind of tactility to see. It's rather based on experience or policy. You don't really get a lot of that materiality. So for me, that's how I enter the studio, is like, how do I illuminate on an issue that maybe is invisible or doesn't really affect everyone, how do I make that kind of a unilateral feeling, and kind of open the discussion? So I think it's important for me to kind of be hopeful about the work being seen as not as kind of vile or taking a step back, but maybe inviting like a look forward to see like a hope. Because say for instance, a lot of the materials that I do use, you know, albeit they're kind of body horror, there's a little bit of a science fiction read, but in the end, the forms that I'm using are food. And they are, you know, kind of figures and subjects of sustenance. So for them to be identified and claimed as something that can, you know, nourish ourselves is like one of the, like a really big eyewitness things to kind of consider when looking at the work. A lot of these things are actually growing food. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking that you're kind of like the vegetarian Paul Tech, you know, where like you would have sort of rotting meat in a cage, but yeah, you stick with the sweet potatoes and stuff.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
You know, speaking of this idea of, you know, a process and finding something that comes after, you know, I was really struck by the title of your previous show at Interstate Projects, which was evoked the idea of passing through. I forget exactly how you framed it. Let me try to bring up an image of that.
Yeah.
Here, stop me when I get to one. Oh, that's not right. Was this in that show?
Yeah, there we go. Yeah. So, you know, this show actually really kind of jumped my thinking towards where it is now in a way, even thinking about the language around what I produce in the studio. This show was in 2016, and you know, this began to really ground a lot of the materials that I continue to use right now. You mentioned before a lot of these more domestic kind of leanings with using plates and domestic furnitures, kitchen furnitures and cabinets. I think for me, what I maybe didn't answer so much in that question before was that the domestic is actually really where I started to use just some of my own stuff to kind of talk about.
It's convenient.
Yeah, to kind of talk about issues that we all kind of deal with, right? So it's like, you know, the great equalizer is like everybody has, you know, a kitchen plate or, you know, that one cabinet that is just a little too dark to really look under. And, you know, I thought of it as the title, Just Passing Through, as a good way to kind of put language to, you know, what we're all actually doing together, you know, out on the street. And when we all coalesce, you know, riding the subway or, you know, just our lives in general, we're just kind of passing through certain motions and routines. And, you know, I think for me, it was a way to kind of think about temporality in my work that is really important now. And in a way, you know, how kind of mercurial a lot of the combinations and a lot of the binders in my work happen. You know, a lot of the kind of jetsam and flotsam happenings and like that kind of glue is two objects kind of passing through into each other. You know, that would really have nothing to do with one another outside of this one kind of unnamed cataclysm or event. So Just Passing Through was like a really kind of interesting way for me to think about a small kind of colloquialism to talk about something really real. That kind of wordage actually came from our Crumb comic, where he has a character, Mr. Natural, who is sort of like a guru who is like scooting scooting by, and there's this one kind of page in that comic where he's just one of the characters says, "Mr. Natural, what does it all mean?" And his reply is, "Just passing through." Scooting by, passed on the sidewalk on a scooter. So just passing through is almost actually a stance of, we don't know what this period means. Like, we don't actually know, we can't control so much. There's a lot of lack of control maybe presented in my work. And I thought that really encapsulated that idea.
We've been talking a lot about your work as sculpture, but we've also been looking at a piece that is a wall relief, right?
Yeah.
And I think there's an interesting relationship between painting and sculpture, physical objects and pictorialism in your work.
Right.
Here, I'll bring up another example, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that relationship.
Oh, right.
Is this is a newer piece?
This work is actually in the Bureau show that's up now.
Great.
And so is this one.
And
so,
do these both hang on the wall?
Yeah, these are both wall works. And I think for me, a lot of the techniques that I feel are necessary, that I, need to kind of bring out a certain amount of believability in the sculptures, definitely deals a lot with painterly techniques. During school, I really was a more 2D artist, definitely doing a lot of printmaking and painting. And I think that really came from me translating the flattening of 2D and 3D in a like urban landscape. The way, wordage becomes like a palimpsest over buildings, the way, certain processes renders a flat object into a 3D object. And for me, I think it really became important to utilize painting and a more 2D approach. I think just a way to kind of really be aware and really be, I don't know, more versed in describing a three-dimensional world. I mean, not everything in sculpture, not everything in the built world exists so much in the round. So much of our existence is more pictorial. And I think also with the histories of sculpture and a lot of the artists that like I'm maybe referencing offhand deal with that kind of buildup of 2D material into a three-dimensional form. So I definitely.
Yeah, I'm really curious about your relationship to modernist sculpture, for instance, and I'd be curious to hear which artists you're really looking at, which historical examples really inform your work. And actually, just before we started broadcasting this, we were talking a little bit about Germano Chalant and Arte Povera.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could explain your relationship to that art movement.
Sure. I mean, I think it's definitely a big movement for me. As far as the kind of even ethos behind that movement and a lot of those artists working at that time, Arte Povera being the, world famous consortium of Italian artists. And like you said, Germano Chalant, who passed this week. But, that movement, was dealing, of course, with a very post-war Italy, very meager materials, but they used a lot of emblematic, to say, materials, like potatoes and things of even their diet, like, just random associations rather with natural resources. My first time to Magazzino in Cold Spring, New York, which is like houses a very big collection of Arte Povera artwork, was over the summer. And, to see a lot of that work in person, it made me really wonder about the lives of the materials that they were actually using in their work. A lot of them use these kind of ethereal, even, very, let's say, non-archival materials in their work. And it made me really wonder about the upkeep of those artworks and how the upkeep is an artwork in itself. And, I really became interested in the way that my thinking about systems in a social structure way, in a very much trickle down way, can almost be analogous to the way their maintenance and that idea of upkeeping sculpture, as far as presenting that work, became very parallel. So I'm very much interested in that work. And then a lot of
two really interesting reference images
sure.
here. This piece, which I believe is in MoMA, right? It's Tatsumi Kudo.
Yeah, this piece in particular, I believe it wasn't as part of the MoMA collection. Yeah, but these are a lot of the same even timeline as Arte Povera, Tatsumi Kudo being in Japan at that time in the 60s and 70s doing these works. But similar to how we mentioned Paul Tech briefly before, a lot of what I find interesting about Kudo and Tech and Arte Povera artists and those movements were how they were reckoning with the world being at a very cataclysmic time, and in a time, almost atomic time, right? So we're thinking about post-war, post-atom bomb, globe, and how, they thought about life being more artificial after that, of those times. And, especially in this sculpture in particular, these fake flowers and these very like plastic looking earth, it almost reminds one of, what we're dealing with actual food and actual material like GMO and a lot of these other, hyper real, hyper, safe produced resources. So for me, it really comes down to a lot of thinking about also what's outside of the material page and the material list and what I'm looking at. But I love to think about the context of these works.
Yeah, I mean, and certainly Arte Povera too. That's coming out of a very fractured society. And I was reviewing some of that literature and really struck by how they were using metaphors of guerrilla war and conflict in relation to the art that they were preparing. So this idea of social breakdown definitely seems pertinent. And then you also sent an image of this work by Kevin Beasley.
Exactly. Yeah. With Kevin Beasley's work, what really draws me to, in combination with what we talked about before, but specifically with his work, it's really grounded in a sense of a sense of my own body. Kevin Beasley being another Black male sculptor, and a lot of what the context he uses is of, his surrounding neighborhood and surrounding, diaspora or community. And, when I first saw his work in my undergrad years, I was really drawn to, I was really portal to a sense of place, like a really distinct setting that was similar to mine. It's like the Midwest, the urban Midwest. And, for me, a lot of material combinations that he was working with, influenced a lot of my earlier time, in undergrad. And so, there you do get a sense of temporality. You do get a sense of like very heavy investment in material. But for me, there's that added kind of context of identity that I, immediately and readily kind of identify with, and identify those kind of subtexts that I really found important to my, current work and thoughts now.
Yeah, I'm very curious about the present, as I can hear some sirens going off in
Yeah.
the background.
Yeah.
Just how are you doing during quarantine? What is your routine like, and has this experience changed the way you think about your own practice at all?
I mean, it's definitely a little difficult. Not being able to necessarily get the right amount of materials because that certain store is closed due to the virus, or you know not necessarily having access to grabbing that interesting piece of any material that I find on the street or something. It really has both been an interesting, ironic time considering the work that I make and thinking about the things that we've been talking about over the course of the hour. I think it's interesting, that kind of thought process that I, in the back of my head, was thinking about has been lived through, and we're living through it. But I do feel that I have been able to slow down a bit, actually, and really make sense of what it means to constitute a 24 hours, on terms that are a little bit outside of, a Fordist 9 to 5 kind of reality, which has been interesting. It's almost as if it almost feels like I'm not really living in America, if that makes any sense. So much of my existence before has been about work, um, work, studio, repeat, and that kind of nature. But now I think we're all dealing with ourselves so much more. So I've been able to kind of think about and also double back and kind of really understand like what I was making in the past couple years with subsequent reading and a lot of time to just really look at stuff. So it's been interesting being in quarantine. And I myself, I'm actually not in the city. I'm in Jersey City. So I'm also another layer of remove from the hustle and bustle a little bit. So I'm grateful for it in the end, though.
You just said something that I'd never heard. I've heard people talk about quarantine in all sorts of different ways. Usually, thinking about how their immediate geography has shifted, how they can't travel as much as they want, or in terms of temporality, how they're losing track of days and time seems to be slow or fast or whatever else. But I've never heard anyone say that it feels like a pause from nationality, from the experience of being in America. But when you talk about it in terms of this sort of post-Fordist condition of the 9 to 5, I think that really connects. Do you see your work as being particularly American, as responding to certain American conditions otherwise?
I think so. And I think what we were talking about a little bit before was maybe a half answer up until now. And I think it comes back to that topic we were discussing of the domestic. I think for me, a lot of the cabinets and a lot of the things I was building in the Bureau show, for me, were a very distinct kind of American foil or backdrop for those kind of designs, if you will, or that kind of those kind of forms. I think for me, a lot of what I position myself in the studio as is knowing I myself a child of 2 immigrants who had a very distinct identity against the backdrop of us living in America. So I was always really aware of 2 different styles of living, or maybe even 2 different material lives. So I think for me, um, this period has really also brought up a lot of that kind of those nasty undercurrents that we try and bury in America. And I think for me, um, it's sort of a time where what's reinforced as, you know, status quo has sort of broken down, and a lot of us have to reckon with, you know, really what does it mean to engage as a republic or as a group of people. You know, people are, like you said, are dealing with this in so many different ways that, you know, our experiences now are very individual. And I always felt that I was in such a distinct individualistic space growing up. And I think
Mhm.
for me, I'm maybe not as shaken as far as like this sort of Fordist, you know, breakdown that we have that's kind of come to a halt, because I think it's been adjusting to that my 29 years. And so when I have a pause from that, I'm able to like really kind of look at the whole picture as um, yeah, something that, you know, without, what is our identity? Maybe that's like a big question that I've been ruminating on this whole period of our quarantine, is that like, what now? Like, what do we identify as now that
Mhm.
we're separate in our homes, without relations to other people so much? Like, what's next?
I mean, do you think the notion of passing through is possible anymore, or do you feel like actually there needs to be more intervention somehow, or do you see those ideas as opposed?
No, I think the notion of maybe passing through doesn't really have to read as so passive a
Mhm.
position. I think with the time that we do have, we should definitely make the best of it. Um, because in the end, I think that passing through then makes sense. In the end, we will all kind of pass into another and let another generation kind of envelop us. But I do think it's not only necessary, but I do think it's like a duty. And I think that's maybe the American identity that I would hope that we can come out of this next, is that we have a duty to kind of make the best happen for everyone.
Mhm.
And maybe that passing through is something more of a spiritual
Mhm.
kind of position. But I do think, you know, with passing through and also kind of where we are now in a state of crisis, I don't think we should necessarily stay in stasis. I do think we should do as much as we can to move forward safely. But, you know, a lot of what I think about in the studio and in the work has been um, definitely unfair, and definitely a position of not really upholding what we think of ourselves as a country. And
Mhm.
I think the systems at B could do a lot to kind of alleviate a lot of these kind of stressors and problems that only really come to the surface when something goes wrong.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Let me get to a couple of the questions that have come in.
Yeah.
Um, so Beatrice is asking, what are the materials?
Uh-huh.
We covered that a little bit, but if anyone has a specific question about a certain material, and just maybe to clarify for people who are coming late, you're casting materials that resemble organic forms, but what is the dominant stuff? It's
Yeah. Yeah. So, oh, yeah. So the material question is specifically, I take um, molds of real objects, and I cast them in a variety of household materials, a very common materials. So in particular, what I do champion is using foam, like household insulation foam. And sort of how I go about making sculptures is they start off very raw and messy, and then kind of make their way into themselves in detail with color and material and texture. So they start off with materials that actually more or less have nothing to do with art making. Again, this is sort of my interest in using like more domestic everyday materials in total to kind of illuminate a lot of what we've been talking about, but it's also a little bit quicker for me to kind of start that way, to kind of start off at the hardware store, use some raw material to make something seem, real, quote unquote. So a lot of the materials come from there, but on top of that, I do use a lot of natural materials, soil, hemp. I use a lot of dirt actually as a pigment. So I use a lot of these like reoccurring and basically natural materials to kind of paint the work, if you will.
The next question is, can you elaborate more on your idea of establishing a common value system between either artist and artist or artist and vendor? Also, can you do it without relying on the current structure of creating capital off of the work? So I'm not sure we got into that so much in the discussion, but I guess it's about the
value
the art world value system and how cultural capital accrues.
Right. I guess the question is asking if the work does that, or can it? Or...
The same questioner K is asks another question. Can you practice restoring artwork as an art practice simultaneously with being at odds with the current system of capital? So I read that as saying, like, this idea of maintaining the work rather than letting it fall apart. Are you just kind of reinforcing the notion of the artwork as a luxury good, as a commodity, something like that?
Oh, right. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely interesting, and I definitely hear what that question is saying. You know, it's hard to think about. For me, it's like not something I really think about when I'm making my work. I mean, at the very least, like, I'm making my work strong enough so that it really just doesn't break. You know, and so, you know, with upholding like a certain value system and about, I think maybe the question is addressing a little bit or talking about maintenance about the artworks. And, you know, with the value system, I think the value really comes from like the conversations that like come after the studio or come out of relaying a lot of the conversations that are like maybe latent in the work. I think maybe that's like the most value that I hold dear to me, is like, you know, really allowing my thoughts and, you know, my position in the studio as, you know, a value to maybe even hold the community in my, like, that I'm thinking about as close to me as possible. So I'm not really sure about like how to make work outside of the capital system that the art world kind of functions as, but I definitely do hold a lot of space for the topics and the people that are like maybe unspoken so much in the work as possible.
That's really interesting. It might relate to a question from Julian. What is your relationship to spirituality, and how do you see the work of artists of the Black Atlantic diaspora with this theme today?
Yeah, I mean, the spirituality is even something that if I really was stating like a really strong position against, I really think I couldn't shake it, because it's really something that has been like foundational, especially speaking of like diasporic terms, you know, for the Black community, spirituality is so important. And you know, that spirituality even goes down to level as low as like what we eat in that cuisine. And I think that's maybe why I'm drawn to a lot of the forms that I am. You know, spirituality for me isn't so much tied to like how we were mentioning before, bringing up Paul Tech and how he was like a very devout Catholic, and a lot of the forms and a lot of the actual subjects of his work was about identifying his kind of shaky relationship with being such a hardcore Catholic. But I think for me, it's not so much about a Christianity or a certain definable denomination of spirituality. I think it's about like, maybe the spirituality aspect comes about like speaking of the past and more like a ancestral spirituality, as to think of like my work, or you know, a lot of the forms that I use as like sacred. Maybe there's like a bit of sanctum rather than spirituality. There's like a hollowed, maybe not so much like a omnipresent like spirituality, like a Christianity, like I was saying, or Islamic, but maybe more as like a natural spirituality, with the forms that I use. So it's definitely there. It's definitely there.
Yeah, that was a great question. I'm glad you
Yeah.
got to it.
Yeah.
And I think that's also a good place to leave things for now.
Yeah.
I just wanted to thank everyone who joined us on the webinar today. And thank you, Brandon, for sharing your thoughts about the work.